Well, there is little that is more gratifying than being cited as inspiration by people who are making a difference. And few people are able to make a greater difference than journalists today, many of whom risk their own safety and too often pay the ultimate price for making truth public. It is therefore truly a great honor for me to be with you here today as you honor the Dag Hammarskjöld Fund for Journalists Fellowship winners, and also to be here as you honor the inspirational Mia Farrow. Hammarskjöld inspired his successors through his moral example and his ingenuity, but more particularly because he enabled this international body to wield real influence. And while decolonization and, it occupied much of his time with the attendant creation of observer and peacekeeping operations, from the dawn of the nuclear age, he knew well that the cost of ultimate failure could be total annihilation. And yet imagine it would be another 65 years before the UN Security Council would endorse the goal of Global Zero, a world without nuclear weapons. Peacekeeping proved Hammarskjöld's greatest legacy. UN peacekeepers are still stationed in a majority of countries recovering from conflict, helping to disarm some 400,000 combatants in the past decade alone, and supervising free and fair elections. I'm particularly proud of Jordan's role in the development of UN peacekeeping, from the hosting of UNTSO, the first observer mission, to the careful formulation in 1958 by Hammarskjöld and my husband, the late King Hussein, of the concept of a UN presence free from national bias or coercive force. Since 1989, more than 50,000 Jordanian peacekeepers have deployed in UN missions around the world. But what would have surprised Hammarskjöld today, however, would not be the proliferation of these operations themselves, but the sadly immutable resilience of some of the world's conflicts. When almost 40 years ago, having forged my own commitment to social and political justice while marching with Martin Luther King and protesting the Vietnam War, I first moved to the Arab world of my ancestral roots. I was overwhelmed by the human suffering I saw everywhere, by the numbers of people whose lives were touched by tragedy, poverty, and powerlessness, the ravages of decades of conflict and insecurity. Everyone I met had a direct connection to the Arab-Israeli conflict and the suffering of the millions of Palestinians who lost their homes, lands, and loved ones during the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the 1967 war and occupation. I was appalled not only by the misery I saw, but by the fact that the rest of the world knew so little about it. In fact, I was on my way to Columbia University's School of Journalism here in New York, where I hoped to study ways to combat that ignorance, when my life took a very different turn. I met my husband, embraced Islam, and took a career path that veered perhaps more towards Dag Hammarskjöld's life of public service than the journalist I might have been, though I see the both as intertwined. For all too many people in my region, the suffering that is almost as old as the UN itself continues 60 plus years later. And yet, we seem to be entering a new era of world history in which the monolithic oppositions of East and West, colonial dominion versus self-determination, or even nation versus nation are breaking down, and the voices of people are rising as never before. From the Arab Spring to Wall Street, protesters are demanding to be heard and challenging injustice and the status quo. In the Middle East, although many inside and outside the region were caught off guard by the unrest, no one should have been surprised. The dynamism, activism, creativity, and self-assertion of millions of young Arabs today has been perhaps the greatest unacknowledged story of our time. Because that self-assertion had not yet welled up into dramatic collective action of the kind that makes headlines and history. The stories were not making news, although, or perhaps precisely because, the protesters' concerns are not new. Many citizens and political observers had long expressed deep discontent, not only with the obvious economic hardship and lack of opportunity, but also with more fundamental problems: region-wide deficits in just and representative governance, the rule of law, human rights, and open participatory societies. Our region has exploded because the combined burdens of material stresses and intangible indignities became just too much for many citizens to bear. And ordinary men and women came to feel that their voices were not heard, their grievances did not matter, and their humanity was dispensable. So what has changed? Paradoxically, while some might cite lack of progress overall in our region in key development indicators, the democratization movement could be said to be a product of development rather than of its failure. When measured purely by per capita income, the MENA region seems to have stalled. Or when commodity prices are factored in, it's actually declining rapidly. However, when health, education, advances and technology penetration are taken into account, it becomes clear that much of the Arab world has reached a level of development that is out of sync with its ossified political systems. 60% of the Arab world is under 30 and facing the highest unemployment in the world. Many of these young protesters are students, educated and exposed enough to know what their rights are, what jobs they desire and deserve, and how to use new technologies to demand them. But it's not only a youth revolution, as many would have it be. Polls and surveys around the region show that youth and adults agree in their discontents. And unrest has grown so large and spread so wide as to produce significant public political challenges, as you know, to half a dozen countries. The tipping point was the result of the intersection of popular frustration with critical developments in mass communication. Courageous men and women gathering by word of mouth to demand their rights as citizens. Arab satellite television captured and broadcast their anger. And new technological, network, and social media developments provided the means, model, and catalyst to bring all the other elements together. In virtually all of the uprisings, at a few critical catalytic moments at the start, cell phones with cameras, which increased 10% last year alone, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, helped to organize, publicize, and galvanize support for the protests. This would have been impossible just a few years ago when access to news and information was controlled by a narrow elite. Internet usage in the Middle East has risen more than 1,800% in the past decade, and in fact now very slightly exceeds the average in the rest of the world. We all have a stake in ensuring that these movements are not hijacked by extremists at either end of the spectrum. Current uncertainty in Egypt, continued violence and tension, even amid varying levels of progress in Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere, warn that positive change is by no means guaranteed. Even where rulers have been deposed, reform must be real. New governments need to genuinely embrace change rather than preserve old power structures under new figureheads and make cosmetic, limited concessions to placate protesters. And in every step of the process, independent journalists play an absolutely crucial role. From Al Jazeera's and Al Arabiya's increasing impact around the world, as widely watched alternative news sources, to the Nobel Prize awarded to Yemeni journalist and activist Tawakkil Karaman, to Arab journalists' determination to drive social change rather than to just report it. Independent journalists have the power to break the stranglehold on information long held by the ruling elites. This is especially true of journalists who are members of the communities where the news is breaking, intimately aware of the dreams and concerns of the people around them, as we've heard actually from the fellows who we listened to earlier. Their stories are not driven by decisions made in corporate boardrooms in distant lands, or by propaganda agendas in local capitals, or even by the viewing choices of consumers who have been conditioned to view news as a source of entertainment. They're driven by what people need and have a right to know, from human rights abuses by governments to environmental degradation by corporations, to famine and health crises in developing nations, to the day-to-day challenges and triumphs of people trying to change the world for the better. Journalists, particularly Arab journalists, have a major role to play as we chart our future course. When everyone with a cell phone camera is becoming a videographer, and everyone with a Twitter feed a blogger, committed, objective journalists are needed now more than ever to provide context and in-depth analysis of the flood of events and identify gaps in the overall picture. Journalists must be aware of simply becoming digital aggregators, gathering posts, tweets, and blogs and passing them along with the disclaimer that we cannot vouch for the accuracy of this report. Governments and political movements inevitably try to erect barriers to news gathering, which professional journalists can surmount by old-fashioned, diligent reporting. Independent media can promote a climate where speech and press are free from both political and financial constraints, as much as I know that's easier said than done. But finally, journalists and media organizations can take pride in more actively embracing new roles as guardians of accountability in these fledgling democracies. To hold power accountable does not only mean challenging authority, it requires high standards of professionalism to enable an informed citizenry to govern itself. We are embarking on an era when diverse voices of the disenfranchised are rising at last. From Tahrir Square to Wall Street, the sound is resonating, setting up mutually reinforcing reverberations of a sort that are set to shatter the heavy glass windows of corner offices and presidential palaces. Those who are making history need accurate, pertinent, unbiased information about what is actually happening in their own communities, and also about what international institutions and the United Nations are doing to help them. And this is what the Dag Hammarskjöld Fellowships are all about. I salute those generous donors who make them possible, the journalists who gave their time or who give their time to vet the applicants, and especially the winners for the excellent work they have done and will continue to do. Having once hoped to join your ranks, it is with great admiration that I say thank you for allowing me to be part of your vital endeavor, especially on this very, very, very special 50th anniversary occasion. Thank you very much.